The numbers didn't make sense, and in Camille Rivera's world, things that didn't make sense had a way of unraveling everything. "Walk me through it again," she said, her voice clipped low and dangerously calm. 12 heads turned toward her across the long glass table in the executive war room. The air was stale with too much coffee and not enough answers. On the giant screen behind them, a single red column flashed like a wound. $50,000, $6,000 projected loss. We had the East Asia sentiment reports triangulated with historical consumer behavior. A man in a navy pinstripe began. Camille cut him off, and yet we didn't see the drop in Japanese mobile accessory demand coming. Why silence? Another advisor leaned in. "Camille, with respect, these are unprecedented variables." The shift came too fast, too sudden. "No." Her tone sharpened. "It came 2 weeks ago. We just didn't listen." A younger woman across the table tapped furiously on her tablet, lips pursed. Camille glanced at her, then back at the board. Charts, arrows, market volatility graphs. None of it explained how they'd gotten blindsided just days before signing a $200 million co-investment deal with one of Japan's largest tech distributors. And now, with the board breathing down her neck and her CFO whispering that she might be the next headline on Forbes' fastest rise. Fastest fall, Camille Rivera was running out of time. "Let's break for 10, she said finally. Her voice cracked for the first time all morning. She didn't wait for responses. She pushed away from the table, heels echoing against polished marble, and walked out before anyone could see the tremble in her jaw. The break room on the 12th floor was barely ever used. Too far from the executive suites. Too close to the maintenance wing. But Camille liked it that way. It had a chipped white kettle, a window that faced an alley instead of the skyline, and most importantly, no analysts. She pushed the door open, ran her fingers through her dark hair, and exhaled for the first time in hours. The soft squeak of a mop paused her steps. A janitor was there near the corner, mid-30s, tall, quiet presence. His back was turned as he wiped the floor with slow, practiced strokes. He wore the standard gray uniform, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal lean forearms dusted with paint smudges or marker ink. He glanced over his shoulder when he saw her. A small nod, then a light, polite smile. Not the nervous kind people gave her. Not the "ma'am, I'm sorry" kind either. It was calm. Then he returned to his mopping without a word. Camille watched him for a beat, something about the stillness around him, oddly grounding. As he pushed his mop bucket out the door, the soft click of the closing door left only the hum of the vending machine behind. She turned to the tea station and grabbed the last sachet of chamomile. Her eyes wandered, then froze. On the far wall behind the break table and a neglected microwave hung an old whiteboard framed in metal that had lost its shine. It was supposed to be used for community notes, fridge cleanup warnings, or the occasional passive-aggressive "don't steal my yogurt." But what was on it now? Wasn't that? Camille stepped closer. Drawn meticulously in blue and black dry erase marker was a supply chain schematic. Regional nodes, behavioral arrows, heat response markers, consumer trend loops. And next to it, a line graph plotting projected buying hesitation in Japanese digital markets. Her breath caught. She had just seen that curve. On the executive screen. Today. And this chart was dated 2 weeks ago. Written in small neat script in the bottom right corner, forecast external volatility spike. Behavioral retreat expected. Peak withdrawal by Q3 unless recalibrated with cultural signal adjustment. Camille stepped back like the board had moved. No one in the East Asia advisory team had drawn this. And this wasn't some doodle. This was strategic modeling, the kind she'd only seen in top consulting decks at Bain or McKinsey. Her mind raced. Who had been in this room 2 weeks ago? She bolted to the hallway, heels clicking like thunder. At the front desk, the receptionist looked up startled. "The 12th floor break room," Camille said, trying to sound casual. "Who usually uses it?" The receptionist blinked. "Just the janitor, I think. The tall guy. Elias. Elias." Camille repeated the name like a password she'd never been told. Last name Monroe. I think he does night shifts mostly, but sometimes fills in mornings. Does he draw on the whiteboard? Yeah, the receptionist said slowly. All the time. Diagrams, quotes. It's kinda his thing. Camille stared back toward the hallway as if the air itself had rearranged. She returned to the break room. The tea had gone cold in her hand. She looked again at the board, this time, not just the diagrams but the edges, the margins, the corner. And then she saw it. Tucked in the lower left edge of the whiteboard, almost like a signature, volatility follows silence. 3 words. Small, quiet, and yet they cut louder than any market bell or boardroom debate. Camille stood there for a long moment, tea forgotten in her hand, eyes locked on the phrase. Elias Monroe, janitor, a man whose mop left no streaks, and whose thoughts had predicted a $50 million collapse before any of her $1 million advisors could. Her breath slowed. Who was he, and why was someone like him hiding behind a mop? When he might just be the only one who saw things clearly, Camille didn't sleep that night. The phrase haunted her, volatility follows silence. It wasn't just a line on a forgotten whiteboard. It was a mirror held up to her entire company, maybe even to herself. By morning, she'd made a decision. She called HR, pulled a file on Elias Monroe. She said, voice steady, pretending this was a normal request, not the strangest impulse she'd had in months. The HR director paused. The janitor. Yes, the janitor. 30 minutes later, the file sat on Camille's desk like an unopened confession. She flipped through it, hired 2 years ago. No disciplinary notes, excellent performance reviews, and a 7-year gap before that. No previous employer listed. No education history beyond University of Michigan, 2008. Nothing more. Camille frowned. She'd seen backgrounds that screamed trying to hide something, but this one whispered trying not to be seen at all. By afternoon, the boardroom was once again a storm of anxiety. The data crisis hadn't gone away. Japan was still pulling out, investors were jittery, and her senior team was slipping from cautious optimism to full-blown panic. The janitor walked in quietly with a mop and a yellow bucket. He wasn't supposed to be here during meetings, but Camille didn't send him away. She just watched from the head of the table as he moved silently around the edges of the room, cleaning glass panels no one else noticed were smudged. He never interrupted, never lingered, but when the projector glitched, Elias stepped forward without a word, adjusted a loose cable, and the charts flickered back to life. "Thank you," Camille said. He nodded once. "Ma'am." Her team continued debating, tossing around jargon like market elasticity, predictive variance, and consumer fatigue. Words that sounded intelligent but meant nothing new. Camille's patience thinned with every sentence. Finally, she turned toward Elias, who was quietly wringing out his mop in the corner. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "can I ask you something?" Every head in the room swiveled. Elias froze mid-motion. "Ma'am." "If you had to guess," Camille said slowly, "why do you think our Japanese partners backed out?" "From your perspective." He hesitated, then set the mop handle against the wall. His eyes flicked between the executives and the screen of tangled charts. "I think." He chose his words carefully. "It's a little like the restroom supply system." The room fell silent. A few people smirked. Camille leaned in. "Go on." Elias continued calmly, unbothered by the awkward glances. "We have a system here. Automated orders for paper towels, soap, toilet paper. It's efficient most of the time. But a few months ago, the system glitched. Sensors thought shelves were full when they weren't. The janitors didn't notice right away because the algorithm said all supplies were stocked." He paused. By the time someone actually looked, 3 floors had run out completely. People started bringing their own. And the problem wasn't the supply, it was trust. Once a system stops reflecting reality, people stop relying on it. They make decisions emotionally, not logically. Even if you fix the system later, it's already broken their confidence. No one spoke. Elias looked down, almost embarrassed. I don't know if that's relevant, ma'am. Just reminded me of what you were saying earlier about data and trust. Camille sat back, her fingers frozen on the pen she'd been clicking for the past hour. That was not a guess. That was systems thinking. The kind of metaphor that took years of strategy training to develop, and he'd said it while holding a mop. Thank you, she said finally. That was surprisingly helpful. Elias nodded, once picked up his mop and returned to work as if nothing had happened. Her advisors exchanged uneasy looks. One of them, the kind who never missed a chance to assert control, whispered, "You're not seriously taking advice from a janitor, are you?" Camille ignored him. Later that day, she found Elias again, this time in the corridor outside the executive offices, refilling a bucket. "Mr. Monroe," she called out. He turned startled but composed. "I looked at your file," she said plainly. "You've worked here 2 years. Before that, nothing. 7-year gap. That's unusual." His jaw tightened slightly. "Some things don't fit neatly on paper." Maybe she said, stepping closer. "But your models on that whiteboard, they weren't janitorial doodles." He sighed, set the bucket down, and leaned against the wall. "I wasn't trying to cause a stir. I just think better when I draw things out. Patterns, feedback loops, cause and effect. It helps me see what people miss." Camille crossed her arms. "And the forecasts that matched real market behavior were those just things you saw." He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "You could say that. When you clean the same floors long enough, you start to see how everything connects. The timing of deliveries, the moods of people, the way pressure moves through a system. Markets aren't that different." Camille studied him carefully. "You ever consider consulting again?" Elias's expression didn't change. "No, ma'am. You'd rather mop floors, I'd rather clear clutter," he said quietly, "whether it's dust in the corners or noise in people's heads." She tilted her head. "You talk like someone who's seen chaos up close." His eyes softened. "I have." Then, almost too softly to hear. "And I've learned that sometimes the only way to help is to keep things steady until others can see clearly again." They stood there in the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. The smell of lemon cleaner filled the air. Camille asked one more question, gentle but curious. "Why do you write on the whiteboard?" Elias looked down at his hands. "Because I see things everywhere. Patterns, models, movements, and I don't want them to disappear. Once I put them down, I can let them go. Otherwise, they stay in my head." He smiled faintly. "Besides, nobody ever reads that board anyway." Camille laughed softly. "Apparently someone does." He looked surprised. "You?" She nodded. "You predicted a market collapse better than our analytics team. That doesn't happen by accident." Elias shook his head. "No, it happens when you've already seen things collapse before." The answer lingered like an echo she couldn't chase. Before she could ask more, Elias picked up his mop again. "If you'll excuse me, ma'am, the conference wing's due for a polish." Camille watched him walk away, the rhythm of the mop like a heartbeat down the hallway. She should have felt foolish letting a janitor's words occupy so much of her mind. But instead, she felt something else, relief. Like someone had cracked a window in a room that hadn't been aired in years. For the first time since the crisis began, she wasn't thinking about stock prices or headlines. She was thinking about a man who cleaned floors and somehow understood human systems better than anyone she'd ever hired. Maybe he wasn't trying to save her company. Maybe he was quietly healing it. That night, Camille stayed late again. When she passed the break room, the lights were dim, but the whiteboard gleamed faintly. New lines had been drawn, loops connecting risk to trust, trust to listening, and listening back to stability. And next to it, a small note in the same neat handwriting: "Cleaning is not about removing. It's about revealing what was already there." Camille stared for a long moment, her reflection caught in the board's glossy surface. Somehow, amid all the noise, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Clarity. Every morning, the executive building came to life in stages. First, the security lights dimmed as the sun broke over the East River. Then came the hum of elevators, the soft scuff of early footsteps, the clicks of coffee machines coming online, and, always precisely at 6:45 a.m., the faint scent of chamomile. Camille didn't notice it at first. Her mornings had been chaotic lately, meetings stacked on top of meetings, back-to-back calls with Japan board members and damage control PR. But the third morning in a row she arrived early. She paused near the break room and caught a familiar calming note in the air. She stepped inside unannounced. There he was. Elias Monroe, in his standard gray janitor uniform sleeves, rolled up head slightly bowed as he poured steaming water into a chipped white teapot. He moved with the same quiet precision she'd seen in everything he did. Even the way he mopped the floor felt intentional, like he was drawing invisible lines no one else could see. He looked up, not surprised, not flustered, just present. "Morning," he said softly. Camille nodded. Her eyes drifted to the tray. 2 cups sat neatly beside the teapot, one to the right and one to the left. The one on the left always remained untouched. "You do this every day?" she asked. He gave a faint smile. "Old habit." She tilted her head. "The cup on the left. Who's that for?" Elias paused, the kettle still in his hand. Then he poured into both cups with steady hands and said almost too gently, "That used to be my wife's. She liked her tea steeped exactly 4 minutes. I still make it for her. Some habits are hard to let go." Camille's throat caught. "I'm sorry," she said. He shook his head. "It's all right. These days I think of it less as holding on, and more as making space. That cup's always there if someone needs it." He gestured to the chair beside the table. Camille hesitated, then slowly sat down. She picked up the left cup. Steam curled softly toward her face. The warmth sank into her hands. "May I?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded once. "It's yours, if you want it." They sat there, 2 people from 2 very different worlds, in a room that smelled of lemon cleaner and quiet comfort. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Camille surprised herself. "You ever feel like the job you wanted became something else entirely once you got it?" Elias didn't flinch. He just listened, really listened, the kind of listening that asked nothing in return. She exhaled. "I became CEO at 34, youngest in the firm's history. 2 hours before the announcement, my father had a stroke in a restaurant. Collapsed mid-laugh right in front of the waiter." Elias stayed silent. "He didn't make it." Camille continued, staring into her cup. "And that morning, the press, the applause, the boardroom full of congratulations, all I could think was, if I had answered his call the night before, maybe he would have gone to the doctor. Maybe I could have." She stopped blinking fast. "Anyway, since then, every decision feels like it could break something. I'm always waiting for the thing I didn't see coming." Elias finally spoke. "You're not alone in that." She looked up. He was staring into his tea the way someone looks at old photographs. She looked at him. Really looked at him. And saw not just the janitor or the strategist, but the quiet ache behind his composure. They both sipped their tea. A slow, healing rhythm. Then softly she asked, "If I asked you to sit in on a private strategy session with the board this Friday, not as a janitor but as an anonymous advisor, would you consider it?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the cup. She still held the one that used to belong to someone else. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "If I can bring the tea," he said. Camille smiled, a rare, unguarded kind of smile. Deal. That Friday would be the most important board session of her career. She'd go in armed with chart strategy and talking points, but this time she'd also carry something more powerful. A quiet mind with a mop and a memory, and a cup of tea that belonged to someone no longer here, but somehow still helping heal. The boardroom on the 38th floor had always carried a chill not from the temperature, but from the weight of judgment that lived in the walls. This was where careers were made, or quietly erased. At exactly 900 a.m., the doors swung open. Camille Rivera entered calm on the outside, caffeine and adrenaline on the inside. A slim leather folio rested in her hand. Inside, a printed version of the hand-drawn model Elias had once sketched on a forgotten whiteboard. She greeted each member of the board with a nod. The chairman, a stern man named Wallace Grant with a voice like gravel, didn't smile. Neither did the CFO nor the stern-faced woman from the global investment arm who'd flown in from London the night before. The last 72 hours had been a war zone of speculation and stress. The Japan deal had stalled, media whispers had started, and Camille knew the room had already discussed contingency plans. And replacements. She stood at the front of the room, cleared her throat. Before we begin formal strategy adjustments, I'd like to walk you through an alternate model of predictive behavior, one that I believe we've overlooked at our own risk. She handed out copies of the diagram. A few eyebrows rose. "What is this?" Grant asked. "A working theory," Camille replied evenly. "Drawn 2 weeks ago. It predicted the exact hesitancy curve we're seeing now in Japanese consumer behavior." The CFO flipped through it and chuckled dryly. "Camille, this looks like it was sketched on a break room whiteboard." "It was," she replied, "but I think you'll want to hear what it says." Someone else, a balding man from operations, gave a low scoff. "This from your data science team." She took a breath. "No, it's from one of our janitors." Laughter broke out, brief but sharp. A woman near the window actually blinked in surprise. "You're presenting a janitor's doodles in a board meeting." Camille didn't flinch. "Not doodles, a system model. And, if you'll allow it, I'd like to bring him in just for 5 minutes. To explain it himself." The room shifted uncomfortably. Wallace folded his arms. "This is highly irregular." "So is losing $50 million in market position," Camille replied. "Please." A pause, then a curt nod from the chairman. 5 minutes. Camille stepped toward the door and opened it. Elias Monroe entered the room. He didn't wear a suit, just a plain white dress shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm tucked into well-worn slacks. No tie, no laptop, just a white ceramic cup of tea in his hand. A few board members stifled visible smirks. Others exchanged looks. But Elias walked in calmly, his posture relaxed but grounded. He nodded at Camille, then at the table. "Thank you for the invitation," he said, voice low but steady. No one responded. Camille took her seat. "This is Elias Monroe. He spent 7 years as a strategic advisor in Japan before taking time away from the corporate world. I asked him here because he sees patterns most of us miss. I'm not asking you to hire him. Just listen." Wallace raised an eyebrow. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Monroe." Elias nodded, then walked to the side of the room where a large dry erase board had been rolled in. He set down his tea on the tray nearby, picked up a marker, and began. "Imagine," he said, "a massive tank of water. Clear, still pressurized. That's your market. The pipes connected to it, those are your consumer channels. If something shifts temperature, pressure, gravity even slightly, the ripples reach every corner of the system." He drew a tank, a pipe, a gauge. "Now imagine there's a crack, not big, just hairline. You don't see it, but the sound changes. The echo in the pipe becomes distorted. That's behavioral data. If you're listening, you hear it before anything breaks." He turned to face them. "But if you rely only on the pressure gauge, your formal data, you miss the sound. You act late." The room had grown noticeably quieter. Japanese consumers didn't back out because of logic, Elias continued. They backed out because of resonance. Something in our offering, timing, tone, posture echoed wrong. The data was right, but the feeling was off. He turned back to the board and drew an open loop, a feedback circle. They pulled away the moment we stopped sounding familiar. Trust like water flows until something disrupts its pattern. Finally, he stepped back. "That's what I saw. That's what this model represents. For a moment, no one moved. Then a woman from finance finally spoke. Do you have equations behind this mathematical model? Elias gave a small smile. No, I have logic, observations, and data, the kind that doesn't live in spreadsheets. He tapped the whiteboard. And I have this. He picked up his tea again, stood in stillness. Wallace leaned back slowly in his chair. You're not wrong. That single sentence shifted the room. More murmurs followed, thoughtful this time. Less amused, more impressed. Then someone asked, would you consider advising temporarily? Just to help us recalibrate. Camille looked over, startled but pleased. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked down into his cup. Then at Camille. If I can bring the tea, he said. A few people chuckled, not mockingly this time. Camille smiled. Deal. That afternoon, as the meeting adjourned, Elias quietly slipped out the back. No handshakes, no declarations. But the whiteboard remained, covered in clean diagrams and soft-spoken truth. And in the place where judgment once sat heavily, there now lingered something rarer in that room. Respect. It started with a whisper Camille overheard in the elevator between the 12th and 14th floors. Two junior analysts were talking, hushed, uncertain, hopeful. One of them said, You know that new product idea Jenna pitched last week? Apparently the board greenlit a prototype. Word is, someone helped her frame it differently. Someone not even in the product team. The doors slid open. Camille stepped out, heart already ticking faster. That afternoon she visited the internal archives. It took some light pressure and a personal login override, but she found what she was looking for. Elias Monroe. Before he became a janitor with neat handwriting and a mop, he had been offered the role of Chief Global Risk Analyst at Takuma Capital, a prestigious Japanese investment firm. It was a role people waited their whole careers to be considered for. He'd turned it down. The note on record was clinical offer declined, cited personal loss, withdrawal immediate, no forwarding employer. The date. 12 days after his wife's obituary. Camille closed the tab slowly. Her breath lingered in the stillness of her office. He hadn't disappeared because he couldn't go higher. He'd disappeared because the world had dropped out beneath him. Later that week, Camille passed the second-floor co-working lounge and spotted Jenna, a usually timid mid-level marketing associate standing beside a whiteboard presenting to 3 senior leads from R&D. Beside her, quiet and unnoticed, stood Elias. He wasn't speaking, just standing at the edge, arms crossed, occasionally nodding as Jenna explained a consumer-facing behavioral incentive model. It was brilliant. Camille lingered just long enough to see Jenna finish her pitch with surprising confidence. The room erupted in positive questions and excited planning. Elias simply gave her a thumbs up and walked out. He never said a word. That night, Camille paused by the break room. The lights were dim, but the whiteboard had changed again. This time, a short phrase was written across the top, surrounded by loops and arrows. Not every risk needs to be avoided. Some need to be held. Together. She stood there a long while, arms folded, thinking not about the boardroom or the Japan deal, but about the way Elias moved through the building like he wasn't fixing things, but quietly enabling others to fix themselves. The next morning, Elias wasn't at his usual spot. Instead, Camille found a kettle of water already hot and a sticky note on the counter. 3 words written in neat capital letters. Back soon. Resting. She frowned, then noticed the tea satchel waiting beside the cup's chamomile as always. She boiled the water, poured it into the pot. And for the first time she set out 2 cups, one on the left, one on the right. When Elias arrived 15 minutes later, his face was a touch paler than usual. There was a subtle tension around his eyes, like he hadn't slept well. But the second he saw the cups already waiting, he stopped. Camille gestured. Sit. You look like someone who's been solving problems without telling anyone. He chuckled softly. Old habits. They sat together, the tea between them. Neither of them spoke for the first minute. Then she asked, "Did you help Jenna restructure her pitch?" Elias took a slow sip. "Not really. I just asked her what problem she was really trying to solve. Turns out she already had the answer." Camille smiled gently. "You're not just smart, Elias. You make other people smarter." He didn't respond, just looked down into his cup. Camille leaned back. "You ever thought maybe that's more important than being the one in charge?" Elias looked up, and for a brief second something softened in his expression, an openness she hadn't seen before. "My daughter," he said finally. "Maisie. She's 8, bright as morning. She asked me once why I never went back to the big buildings, to the big titles." He held the cup steady in his hands. "I told her. I chose a job that let me be the first face she saw after school. That was the only decision that ever felt truly right after I lost her mom." Camille's heart tugged in her chest. She hadn't expected that. Not today. Not like this. "I clock out at 3:30, he continued. "Every day. No meetings, no calls. I'm at the school gates with a granola bar and a knock-knock joke. Every time." Camille swallowed. "Sounds like a well-built risk strategy." Elias smiled. "Best one I've ever designed." Over the next few days, something unspoken began to bloom. Not in grand gestures, not in dramatic meetings, but in the quiet. When Camille arrived early, Elias had already filled the kettle. When Elias had a cough one morning, Camille brought honey and lemon drops and left them on the counter, no note needed. One afternoon, Camille noticed the mop closet door slightly ajar and saw a stack of books inside, all on systems theory psychology leadership. Not dust-covered, annotated, read and reread. Later that week, a new quote appeared on the whiteboard. Smaller than the others, almost shy. "Healing begins where attention goes." It didn't say who wrote it, but she knew. Friday came fast. Camille stood by her office window, the city humming far below. She thought about the board, the upcoming votes, the market shifts. But for the first time she didn't feel alone at the helm. She glanced at the corner of her desk. 2 teacups, only one full, the other waiting. She smiled gently, because some risks weren't meant to be calculated. Some were simply meant to be shared. Saturday mornings at the Bellerose corporate campus were quiet. The usual tide of power suits and rapid footsteps gave way to janitors waxing floors, maintenance teams doing monthly checks, and the occasional executive catching up on emails in silence. Camille wasn't supposed to be there. Not officially. But something in her lately refused to rest. She'd stopped by, early, no entourage, no assistant, just a reusable coffee cup in hand, and a plan to check inventory processes on the lower floors. The East Wing elevators were down for maintenance, so she took the stairs humming softly to herself, mind still replaying yesterday's strategy realignment session. That's when she heard a tiny giggle. She paused on the landing between the 5th and 6th floors. Another giggle, and the scratch of marker against whiteboard. She peeked through the glass into the small open lounge, rarely used, mostly storage and old desks. In the corner, crouched cross-legged on the floor with a giant flip chart pad and a rainbow set of markers, was a little girl. She had a frizzy ponytail, untied shoelaces, and an oversized cardigan hanging off one shoulder. Camille smiled faintly, then gently knocked on the glass. The girl looked up. Wide, hazel eyes. Familiar eyes. "Hi," Camille said softly. "Sorry to interrupt. I didn't know someone was in here." The girl blinked. "It's okay. Dad said I could use the paper while he cleans the elevators." Camille stepped in. "Your dad works here." The girl grinned. "He cleans here. His name's Elias." Camille's heart skipped. "You're Maisie." The girl nodded proudly. "Yep, Maisie Monroe, age 8 1/4. Camille knelt beside her. "Well, Miss Maisie, that is a very large drawing." Maisie beamed and held it up. It spanned nearly the full length of the chart paper, an elaborate grid made of rectangles and small figures, each with speech bubbles or tiny names written underneath. "It's my version of the building," she said, pointing to a section. "This is the break room, and this is where Daddy keeps the mop water, and this is where Miss Jenna works. She gave me jelly beans." Camille laughed. "It looks like a game board." Maisie nodded solemnly. "It's a chessboard." Camille blinked. "A chessboard?" "Yep. Daddy taught me. All the people are chess pieces. But not the boring kind." "My kind." She pointed to various boxes. "This one's the Queen," Maisie explained. "She always moves first. Everyone watches her." Camille arched an eyebrow. "And who's that?" "The yeller," Maisie said, giggling. "She always tells people what they did wrong." Camille smiled. "Sounds familiar." Maisie moved her finger to another square. "That's the Invisible Man. He watches everything, but no one ever sees him. He knows where all the snacks are." Camille's heart softened. "Where's your dad?" Maisie didn't hesitate. She pointed to a square just off-center shaped slightly differently than the rest. "A horse." "This one," she said proudly. "The knight." Camille tilted her head. Why the knight? Maisie looked up at her like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because he protects people. And his moves are funny. You never see him coming, but he always ends up in the right spot." Camille blinked. Somewhere deep in her chest, something uncurled. That child's insight cut through years of boardroom logic and business speak with one simple truth. He doesn't just clean. He protects, he guides, and he does it so no one sees. That afternoon, Camille found herself walking through the lower wings of the building, the ones people passed without seeing: loading docks, supply closets, tech storage. She started asking questions. Not about revenue, not about KPIs, but about how people were doing. The first janitor she asked nearly dropped his mop in surprise. The mailroom manager stumbled over her words. Camille made her way through every level, notebook in hand, not as a formality, not for press, but because she realized they saw what others didn't. They heard the complaints before HR. They noticed system gaps before analytics. And, most of all, they cared. That evening, Elias returned from his rounds to find the break room unusually tidy. Someone had wiped the whiteboard, refreshed the tea station, and left a fresh notepad on the side table. Camille was sitting at the table, sipping chamomile. "Busy day?" she asked, glancing up. He nodded. "Some system updates on the lower floors. Mailroom got a new heat sensor. Water tank still squeaks when pressure builds too fast." She smiled. "You ever feel like you see the whole building differently?" Elias hesitated, then shrugged. "I just notice what people forget to look at." Camille slid a folder across the table. He opened it. Read, quietly, slowly. She didn't speak until he looked up. "You inspired this," she said simply. Elias didn't smile. But there was something in his eyes, surprise maybe, or something warmer. His voice was quiet. "Most people don't ask the floor how it feels before they walk on it." Camille responded. "Maybe it's time we did." He looked down again. At the bottom of the page there was a small printed quote. She'd pulled it from the whiteboard herself. "Not every risk needs to be avoided. Some need to be held. Together." Outside the glass window, the last of the sunset stained the sky orange and gold. Elias stood to leave, but paused. Camille noticed. He pulled something from his bag, a folded piece of paper colored in marker and crayon. He handed it to her. It was Maisie's chessboard drawing. One square circled in blue, labeled "The Queen Who Started Listening." Camille looked up, eyes stinging. She whispered, "She's smart." Elias smiled. "Very." It began with a headline. "Breaking internal shakeup at Belarus, rumors of CEO exit surface amidst Japan deal fallout." It spread like wildfire across finance blogs, LinkedIn whispers, Slack channels. Belarus's stock dropped 11% by noon. By 3 p.m., the Tokyo partnership called for a strategic pause. Camille stared at the screen in her office. Her inbox was flooded with press requests. Her legal team was already drafting a statement she hadn't approved. Her board, silent. Too silent. She slammed her laptop shut, breath caught in the cage of her chest. This wasn't a leak. It was a knife in the back, precise, timed, intentional, and it had come from inside. By evening, she was pacing the executive hallway, red scarf tossed across her arm, mind spinning. Every move she made now had to be calculated, but calculated from what there was no trail, no email chain, no voicemail, no evidence, only the timing, the language in the articles, the way it parroted internal phrasing used in a closed session, a session only 5 people had attended. She needed proof, but what she had was doubt, and doubt wasn't enough to stop a sinking ship. 2 floors below, Elias Monroe was finishing up his routine. He moved through the east wing with ease, pushing his mop cart with one hand, humming softly under his breath. As the elevator arrived, he stepped in expecting silence. Instead, he was on the 14th floor, pushing his cart past the executive meeting wing. He paused. Room 14B. The small high-partner conference room had a light on even though the cleaning schedule listed it as empty. He pushed the door open. The room was cold and smelled of expensive dark roast coffee. He always recognized the scent. It was the specific blend Jonathan Reese, a senior advisor, always requested. Elias began to clean, but his eyes scanned the room like an analyst. He was noticing a pattern. This was the 3rd time in 2 weeks he'd had to clean this room off schedule, and each time it was immediately following a closed-door board session. He bent down to clear the trash near the shredder. Mostly shredded paper, but one crumpled yellow sticky note had missed the bin. He uncrumpled it. 3 phrases scribbled in hasty blue ink. Strategic pause. Not decisive enough. Leadership transition. Elias's heart slowed. He recognized those words. They were near exact matches to the phrases in the leaked articles. He glanced at the whiteboard. It was mostly erased, but in the bottom corner a hasty wipe had left the faint ghost of a name. Reese. Elias stood there for a long moment, the yellow note resting in his palm. This wasn't a leak. It was a coordinated campaign from the inside. A pattern had just clicked clear and sharp into his mind. The next morning, the break room was unusually quiet, but the whiteboard loud. Across the center of the board, Elias had drawn a timeline of conference room bookings from the past 2 weeks, color-coded by which board members had used which rooms and when. Below that, a set of sample phrases, pulled from the leaked article, were pinned beside notes from internal meetings. Camille entered mid-step and froze. Who wrote this? She asked, though she already knew. Elias stood in the corner sipping tea. I did. She stepped closer, reading the columns. Her eyes widened. These match. Almost word for word. He nodded. The elevator recorded a fragment of a call. The timestamp matched a late entry on the 14th floor. That room wasn't on the cleaning schedule, but I remember scrubbing it. It had a coffee spill. The only person who used that room last minute was listed on the schedule in blue ink. He pointed. Jonathan Reese Camille whispered. A senior advisor, long-tenured. Smooth, smiling. One of the 5 in that closed-door session. He rebooked the same room 3 times last week. Always right before you had board discussions, Elias added. Camille turned slowly toward him. You think he leaked it? Elias shook his head. I'm not accusing anyone. Then what are you doing? He glanced at the board. Just cleaning, not the mess, the misunderstanding. She stared at the patterns, the connections, the quiet brilliance. And then something remarkable happened. By mid-afternoon, 3 other board members had wandered into the break room, casual curiosity leading them to the whiteboard. One of them saw their own phrase, the same one quoted in the article, and stiffened. Another saw the pattern of Reese's meeting overlaps and blanched. By 4 p.m., Reese's calendar had mysteriously cleared. By 6, he'd sent in his resignation. No press statement, no drama, just silence. The kind Elias always noticed first. Camille sat in her office that evening, her heels kicked off a cup of tea, steaming in her palm. Elias sat across from her, quiet as ever. You didn't expose him, she said. I didn't need to, Elias replied. The pattern was enough. People just had to see it. She smiled, tired but amazed. You solved a potential corporate espionage scandal with a whiteboard and a mop schedule. Elias tilted his head. And tea, he added gently. Camille chuckled. Of course, always the tea. She stared into her cup for a long moment. You ever wonder what your life would have looked like if you'd stayed in the boardroom? Elias didn't hesitate. Every day. Camille nodded, expecting that. Then he continued. But I also wonder what I would have missed. She looked up. Elias held her gaze. Maisie's spelling bee. The look she gives me when I show up at the school gates. The mornings we draw on napkins. The silence I finally learned to respect. He smiled faintly. Some things are worth more than title and leverage. She swallowed, like helping an entire boardroom see the truth without saying a word. Elias leaned back. Laundering trust is a delicate thing. Camille laughed softly. You know, you speak like someone who's always halfway out the door, but every time I look around, you're still here. He took a slow sip of his tea. Sometimes cleaning up isn't about leaving. It's about preparing a space so others can stay. She looked at him a moment longer, then whispered, You ever get tired of being the one who sees what no one else does? He looked at her with eyes that had known too much pain and too much grace to let it make him bitter. Not really, he said. Why not? Because showing people where the spill is the only way they'll stop slipping. Camille didn't say another word. She just sat beside him in silence, tea between them, the sound of the city soft outside the window. And in that quiet, she realized Elias Monroe wasn't just the janitor. He was the strategist no one hired, but everyone needed. The executive suite had never felt so quiet. Camille stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the skyline. Below her, the city hummed as usual, trains, taxis, footsteps. But inside this office, something had shifted. Something internal. Something personal. She turned when she heard the door click open. Elias entered in his usual quiet way. No fanfare. Just his steady presence, the faint smell of black tea and linen trailing behind him. He wasn't wearing the janitor's gray uniform today, just a crisp white shirt sleeves rolled collar open. He looked less like someone walking through someone else's company and more like someone who had once built one. Thanks for coming, Camille said, motioning to the chair across from her. He didn't sit. She didn't either. Instead, she walked to the conference table where a sleek black folder sat waiting. She opened it slowly, then turned it toward him. I want you to come on board. Officially, she met his eyes. Chief Risk Strategist. Elias didn't move. Camille continued, voice even but sincere. I've already cleared it with the board. After last week, they'd be foolish to say no. But I'm not asking because of politics. I'm asking because I've never trusted someone's instincts the way I trust yours. Still, Elias didn't reach for the folder. Camille stepped closer. You don't have to wear a suit or sit in corner offices. You can bring your tea, your markers, your whiteboard. Heck, bring your mop cart if it makes you feel grounded. A small smile twitched at the corner of his mouth. But I want you here, she said softer now, with a title that reflects what you already are to this company. Elias finally looked down at the folder. Then he slowly took a seat, hands folded. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked up. I appreciate it, he said. Truly, but I can't accept. Camille blinked. Why not? Elias exhaled, his gaze distant. Years ago in Tokyo, I was consulting for a healthcare firm. They were modeling outbreak scenarios, respiratory failure patterns. I ran simulations, hundreds of them. He paused. Camille waited. My wife had been feeling off. Tired, shallow breathing fevers that came and went. I logged it, tracked it. I ran her symptoms against the model. Statistically, it didn't match the threat profile. His voice grew quieter. So I told her not to worry. The silence thickened. Turns out the model was right about the masses, but wrong about her. Camille's breath caught. She died 3 days later. Septic shock. Undiagnosed pneumonia masked by autoimmune response. 1 in a million case. He looked at her, and I had all the data in the world. His hands were steady, but his eyes weren't. I don't trust myself anymore in rooms where decisions about lives are made from charts. I missed the most important variable once: her voice, the feel of her hand, the instinct that something was wrong. He gave a thin smile. So now I clean. I listen. I notice. But I don't judge. That's the deal I made with myself. Camille stepped back. Not because she disagreed, but because she understood the weight in his refusal. Still, she said quietly, "Then don't come to judge. Come to help me listen to the things no one says." Elias looked at her for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. He stood, nodded once, then turned to go. But just before reaching the door, he paused, reached into his pocket, and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. One word written in neat black ink. Possibly. That night, Camille worked late. Her office was dim city lights dancing against the glass. The folder still sat on the table, unopened. She picked up Elias's note again, turned it over in her hand. Possibly. Not no, not yes. But a door, slightly open. She ran her finger over the ink, wondering what it would take to help him believe in his voice again. Just as she was packing up, her assistant knocked lightly and slipped in with a puzzled smile. "This was left at reception for you," she said. From a child, apparently, Camille raised an eyebrow, took the small paper. Crayon lines danced across the surface. It was a sketch, messy bright, a teacup with a smile, a little girl holding hands with a tall man, and next to them a woman in a red scarf holding a pencil that pointed toward a whiteboard filled with stars. In wobbly block letters at the bottom, it read, "Thank you for giving my dad a reason to smile again." Maisie Camille stared at it. Her throat tightened. She pinned the drawing next to her desk lamp and turned off the lights. No words were needed, because sometimes leadership wasn't about directing a company. Sometimes it was about knowing when to sit beside someone else's silence and let healing speak instead. The shareholder meeting was held in the North Atrium, a sunlit auditorium with glass walls and high ceilings designed to impress. It usually did. Rows of tailored suits filed in that morning, murmuring in low, polished tones. Every seat had been claimed. Press was excluded, but the air buzzed like it knew something important was about to unfold. Camille stood backstage, straightening the cuffs of her blazer, going over her talking points. But her mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on a simple folded note that now lived in the inside pocket of her jacket. Possibly. A door left open. A maybe with a heartbeat. Then came the click of polished shoes on tile. She turned and nearly smiled. Elias Monroe was walking toward her. Jacket-pressed shoes shined, and shockingly a black tie knotted neatly at his collar. She blinked. "You wore a tie," she said, quietly stunned. He gave a modest shrug. "Didn't want to. But today, I want to be heard." Camille studied him. Something about the way he stood, not self-important but anchored, felt different. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply choosing to show up. The lights dimmed. Camille took the stage first, delivering her planned remarks, market performance board decisions, pivots in the Japan deal. She was sharp, clear-poised. But the real moment was yet to come. "I'd like to invite someone who's helped shape a new lens for how we assess risk, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of people." She turned toward the wings. Elias stepped onto the stage. No applause, no reaction, just stillness. He approached the whiteboard that had been rolled onto the stage, his only request. No slides, no mic, no script, just a board and a pen. He looked out across the room, faces that had dismissed him just weeks ago, eyes that once looked through him. "My name is Elias Monroe," he began. "You've probably seen me in the hallways, pushing a mop, refilling soap, emptying bins. That's not a metaphor. That's what I've done for the past 2 years. A few people glanced at each other uncertain, but before that I spent 7 years as a strategic advisor in Tokyo. Then I disappeared, on purpose. He walked to the board and began to draw. Not markets, not bar charts, just a simple web of boxes labeled Reception Security Janitorial Mailroom Floor Runners. These are the people who see your company from the ground up, not through dashboards, through footsteps, through overheard concerns, through patterns of silence in places where voices should be. He drew arrows between the boxes. When we talk about risk, we talk about numbers. But the slowest collapses don't begin with markets. They begin when people at the edges stop being seen, when those who notice the first cracks aren't asked what they see. Now the room was still, dead still. I'm not here to pitch a fund. I'm here to show you what your balance sheet doesn't track. He gestured to the web. This model predicts attrition burnout and cultural collapse before it shows up in reports. It's made of people, of voices, of the unmeasured. He paused, and I learned it with a mop in my hand. A hand went up in the back. A tall man, gray suit, expensive glasses, stood. I used to think you were just a janitor, he said not unkindly. Elias looked at him calm and steady. I still am, he replied. The difference is, today I'm cleaning up the way you see. A low, reverent murmur swept across the room. No laughter, no dismissals, only listening. Camille watched from the side, and something in her chest loosened. Not pride, not victory. Something quieter. Belief. For the first time, she wasn't the only one who saw what Elias carried. The meeting closed with a standing ovation. Not for numbers, but for clarity. Later that day, Elias returned to the break room. His jacket was off the tie, folded neatly and placed beside his tea mug. The whiteboard was still there, now smudged with half-erased arrows and a few fingerprints. He set down his bag and rolled up his sleeves, ready to clean up like he always did. But then he paused. On the table was a teapot, freshly steeped, 2 cups, his usual seat, and a sticky note. 6:45 a.m. Yours if you're still showing up. See. He sat down, lifted the cup, and let the silence do what it always did best, heal what hadn't been said. Camille watched from the hallway for a moment before turning away. She didn't need thanks. Not today. Today she was just the one who waited with the tea. And maybe that was leadership too. The new Bellerose building was quieter than expected. Still gleaming, still corporate, but softer in some ways. Camille had insisted on natural light in every room, green corners on every floor, and a break room that didn't feel like a bunker. But the most unusual feature lived on the 3rd floor. A wall, 8 feet tall, blank, clean, magnetic white, stretching across the entire east corridor. No brand logos, no motto, just a simple plaque on brushed steel whiteboard of quiet ideas. Every voice matters, especially the ones you almost missed. That morning, Camille stood beside it with her arms folded, watching Elias walk down the hallway with someone skipping beside him. Maisie. The little girl had grown since Camille first met her. She wore a blue hoodie 2 sizes too big, 1 sock mismatched, and a backpack with a worn-out drawing of a knight and queen on the front flap. When she saw Camille, Maisie waved excitedly. Camille waved back. You ready? Maisie grinned. I brought markers. Good. Elias said, his voice warmer than Camille had ever heard it. Because this board's been waiting for your ideas. The 3 of them stood before the wall. The marker Camille handed Maisie squeaked as she uncapped it. Maisie stood on tiptoes and carefully wrote in big, uneven letters, My dad hears things nobody else hears. She stepped back, hands on her hips, and added below it, That's how he helps people without them even knowing. Camille stared at the words, a lump forming in her throat. Elias didn't say anything, but his fingers grazed the board, lightly tracing the curve of his daughter's handwriting. I told her she could write whatever she wanted, he said softly. Didn't expect that. Camille looked at him, her voice quiet. I did. They spent the next hour walking through the new space offices not yet assigned break rooms already brewing coffee conference rooms without names. People passed them in the halls and nodded to Elias now, not out of politeness but with recognition. He wasn't the janitor anymore, but he hadn't stopped cleaning, not the floors, but the blind spots, the broken ways of seeing. When they reached the quiet cafe on the rooftop terrace, Maisie skipped ahead to the chalkboard menu, fascinated by the idea of a herbal honey latte. Camille and Elias found 2 chairs near the edge looking out over the playground being built across the street. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked after a moment. "Miss what not being seen?" He thought for a while. "It's easier to observe when no one's looking at you." She smiled. "You still can. Just with a title now." He chuckled. "That's the trick, isn't it? Staying invisible enough to see the truth but visible enough to do something about it." There was a long, easy silence between them. Then Elias shifted in his seat, turning toward her. "If I said I wanted to try," he began slowly, "not just the title, but us, whatever this might be, would that be too much?" Camille looked at him, not like a CEO, not like a decision-maker, just as herself. "You've already started walking," she said softly. "I'm just trying to catch up." He smiled. They didn't kiss. There was no swelling music, no dramatic embrace. Just 2 teacups placed side by side on a quiet cafe table, 2 chairs angled toward the same horizon, and a little girl scribbling ideas on a chalkboard menu behind them. And somehow that was the loudest kind of love. Before they left, Maisie ran back to the whiteboard and added one more line under her earlier message. "Sometimes the quietest people are the ones fixing everything." Elias crouched beside her. "What made you write that?" Maisie shrugged. "Because I watched you. And Miss Camille. And I think you're kind of like tea." Elias blinked. "Like tea?" Maisie grinned. "Yeah, you don't yell. You just steep slowly. But it changes the whole cup." Camille turned away for a moment, pretending to check her phone, trying not to tear up. Because in all her years of building strategies and surviving boardrooms, no one had ever made her feel more understood. The training room on the 6th floor used to be dull. Beige walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, coffee that tasted like cardboard. But today there was something different in the air. Employees filled every seat, junior analysts, operations staff, new hires still finding their footing. Some of them fidgeted, unsure why they'd been invited to this optional workshop titled Systems Thinking from the Basement to the Boardroom. At the front of the room stood a man they'd all seen before but never really noticed. Elias Monroe. No suit, no PowerPoint, just a black marker in hand and a soft glint in his eyes like he was about to tell you something important that had nothing to do with profit margins. He drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard, A loop, labeled observation, pattern, insight, action, reflection. Then he turned to the room. "You don't have to wear a title to lead," he said. "You just have to see the system for what it is, and choose to care." People leaned in. Something about the way he spoke, measured, unhurried, cut through the noise in their heads. "I used to push a mop," he continued, "and before that I pushed numbers. But, in both roles, I realized the same truth systems break, not because they're weak, but because the quietest parts stop being heard." He told stories about pressure valves that failed because no one asked maintenance what the strange sound meant, about brilliant product ideas that started as anonymous notes scribbled on a break room wall, and about a girl who once drew her dad as a knight on a chessboard. By the end of the hour, no one wanted to leave. One intern whispered to another, "I thought this was just going to be about flowcharts." The other replied, "I think that was the flowchart. Just human." Meanwhile, across the city, Camille Rivera took the stage at a TEDx conference in Brooklyn. She was no longer the rising star CEO people whispered about behind closed doors. She was now the voice pushing a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in dominance, but in listening. Her talk was titled, "Hearing the Invisible Leadership Beyond the C-Suite." She opened with a simple story. A janitor once drew a model on a whiteboard, not because he was asked to, but because he couldn't not draw what he saw. That model saved a company exposed to betrayal and reshaped our culture, but he didn't do it to be heroic. He did it because no one else would. The audience leaned in. Camille spoke of quiet workers with brilliant ideas, of hallway conversations that carried more insight than data dashboards, of how she learned the most about risk not from Wall Street, but from a man holding a mop who refused to stop noticing. By the time she left the stage, the applause wasn't just loud, it was knowing. She wasn't just talking to executives, she was talking to everyone who had ever felt invisible and still chose to care anyway. Back at headquarters, something else had changed. A few months earlier, a logistics assistant named Irene had scribbled a note on the whiteboard of quiet ideas. Just a small observation about a bottleneck in the internal courier routes. A week later, Elias had circled it with a green marker and drawn a flowchart underneath. No signature. No fanfare. 3 weeks after that, the mail system was restructured across 4 floors. Efficiency improved by 17%. Irene got promoted, not because she spoke the loudest, but because someone had been listening. Elias didn't carry a title card anymore. No one called him Chief Risk Strategist. He never asked for that. But in meeting rooms and break rooms, people referred to him as the guy who notices things, the one who sees the system differently, the mentor who shows up even when he doesn't have to. And somehow that meant more than any 3-letter acronym after his name. Inside the CEO's office, Camille had made one final change. On the far wall just behind her desk hung a small square whiteboard. Clean, borderless, just large enough for a few thoughts. No one else was allowed to write on it, except Elias. Every Monday morning she'd come in early and find a new line scribbled there. Sometimes it was a question, sometimes a diagram, sometimes a phrase like check the hallway before the headlines. Trust what isn't being said. Tea only brews when the water is still. She never erased them. She just added dates. That spring, during one of the monthly town halls, Camille was asked by a junior employee, "What was the most important decision you ever made as CEO?" She didn't even blink, listening to someone who wasn't trying to speak. The room went still. And somewhere in the back row, Elias, as usual, was leaning against the wall, quiet, observant, unchanged. Except for one thing. This time, everyone saw him. The office was unusually quiet that morning. Spring had begun to show its first signs, soft sunlight spilling through the tall windows, the scent of blooming jasmine wafting in from the planters Camille had insisted on placing along the terrace. She stood near the tea counter in the break room, stirring a cup without really paying attention. Her eyes flicked toward the corner where Elias usually sat at 6:45 sharp, sipping from his favorite ceramic mug, the one Maisie had once decorated with a gold marker. But his chair was empty. She glanced at her watch. 7:12 a.m. Late. Unusual. Then she heard the familiar shuffle of footsteps. Elias stepped into the room, but something about him was different. His movements were slower, deliberate. He wasn't holding his mug. "Morning," Camille said softly. Running behind, he gave her a small smile, but didn't approach the kettle. She tilted her head. "No tea today." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then placed a folded piece of paper on the table beside the teapot. It wasn't a resignation letter. Not this time. Camille picked it up and unfolded it, her eyes scanning the page. Her brows lifted slowly. Across the top, bold letters read, "Proposal, the Human Strategy Center." A new division, not for profit, not for press, but for people. A place where companies, startups, nonprofits, founders with vision but no roadmap could come to learn how to build systems that listened, not just operated. The model detailed workshops, mentorships, risk mapping through empathy, and cross-industry mentorships that centered on dignity, not disruption. And at the bottom, in careful print, co-founders Camille Rivera and Elias Monroe. Camille looked up, heart thudding gently against her ribs. You think we'd make good co-founders? She asked, half teasing, half breathless. Elias shrugged lightly. I think, he said, pausing to meet her gaze, we're good at cleaning up what no one else sees. Maybe it's time we build something that doesn't need to be cleaned at all. She exhaled slowly, the weight of 100 quiet moments settling gently between them. Then she smiled. Not the polished boardroom smile, not the press release smile. A real one. And here I thought the last thing I'd co-found would come from a janitor and a tea habit, she said. Elias raised an eyebrow. Technically, I was always more of a systems architect with excellent mop skills. She laughed. Fair enough. That afternoon, Camille cleared her calendar. The three of them, Camille, Elias, and Maisie, found themselves seated on the rooftop terrace where the city felt far enough away to dream. Maisie sipped warm apple cider from a ceramic oil mug. Camille poured tea into 3 cups just the way Elias liked it. No ceremony, no speeches, just silence. The good kind. A blank whiteboard stood near their table, fresh, magnetic waiting. Elias had wheeled it up with a grin, claiming no big idea starts without a whiteboard nearby. Camille watched Maisie doodle suns and tiny stick people in one corner, then turned back to Elias. Are you sure? She asked. About stepping out of the shadows like this? Elias glanced at his daughter, then back at Camille. I'm not stepping out. I'm inviting more people in. That answer settled something in her. She uncapped a black marker, walked to the board, held it there for a moment. Then she wrote in simple, steady strokes, What no one dares to say is where we begin. She stepped back. Elias stood beside her, and Maisie, curious, looked up. That's kind of like what you always write, she said, but it sounds like everyone can write it now. Camille crouched beside her. That's the whole idea, sweetheart. Elias sat down again, lifting his tea to his lips. Camille joined him. No big ending, no applause, just 3 cups of tea. A whiteboard waiting. And a future neither of them had planned for, but both of them were finally ready to step into. Together. Sometimes the most powerful strategies aren't written in boardrooms but in silence. On whiteboards no one notices. Over quiet cups of tea, shared between 2 people who dare to listen. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to pause and ask yourself, who in your life has been the Elias? Or maybe have you ever been that quiet voice waiting to be heard? Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone invisible changed everything? We'd love to hear it. Share your story in the comments below. Your words might just be the cup of tea someone else needs today. And before you go, let us know where you're watching from. It always warms our hearts to see this storytelling family growing across the world. If you haven't already, hit subscribe so you never miss another story like this. Stories about kindness, courage, and the quiet people who change the world without ever raising their voices. From all of us here, thank you for watching. And until next time, stay kind, stay human, and remember what no one dares to say is exactly where we begin.